Hey guys, I'm back, welcome back to the channel, and in today's video I'm going to be doing a movie review on 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple. This is the fourth film in the 28 Later franchise. It was released in 2026. It stars Ray Fiennes, Jack O'Connell, and Alfie Williams. In this film, Dr. Kelson makes a discovery that could change the world as they know it, and Spike's encounter with Jimmy Crystal becomes a nightmare he can't escape. Now, point of reference, I'm a really big fan of these movies. This was absolutely one of my most anticipated films of the year. Obviously, 28 Years Later was a pretty divisive installment, but I was a really big fan of it, and I was absolutely looking forward to seeing where this story would go and how they were going to continue it with this film. So without further ado, let's begin with this review and let's start talking about the positives. First thing I'll say here is that this is a successful continuation of 28 Years Later that's just as intriguing, just as riveting. It takes just as many risks with the franchise, risks which ultimately pay off. What's interesting about this film is how it manages to be so different from 28 Years Later whilst also managing to sit alongside that movie very nicely in terms of tone, style, and story. It is basically entirely a departure from 28 Years Later, but like I said, it still manages to sit alongside that film very nicely. Obviously, the different feel here is largely thanks to Nia DaCosta directing, and she does a really solid job with it. She's able to bring her own flair to it without having it feel inconsistent with what came before and very much making a 28 Later movie. This film also does work quite well as a middle chapter, obviously, of this trilogy, and just as a continuation of 28 Years Later in general. You know, making middle of the trilogy films is often a challenge, but this film very much feels like it's able to continue the story, and by the time it ends, it very much feels like we get somewhere, and it works well as a bridge. Definitely a highlight here is the performances, mainly from Ray Fiennes and Jack O'Connell. Ray Fiennes continues to be really solid as Dr. Kelson. He brings a lot to his character, and Jack O'Connell is really good as Jimmy Crystal. You know, he's able to be genuinely scary and threatening whilst also being weirdly kind of charming and charismatic in a way. Just a performance that really puts you on edge. And, you know, from the rest of the cast as well, you know, the rest of Jimmy's gang, Alfie Williams continues to be really solid as Spike. Just really good performances in this movie. Similarly to 28 Years Later, this film explores some really interesting themes. Other people can talk about this much better than I can, but, you know, just a load of interesting stuff is looked at here in very interesting ways, you know, sort of stuff about kind of cult worship and sort of evil of humanity, that kind of thing. You know, interesting ideas are looked at in very interesting ways, and the film just executes its ideas in general in really interesting and really quite compelling ways. With this film, I'm very happy to report that, you know, the storytelling is really engaging, which is certainly a strength of this franchise, in my opinion. Really glad to see all that continued here. Also, similarly to 28 Years Later, you know, on a technical level, it's really solid. You know, cinematography, whole film looks really nice, very impressive in that regard, and on a sound design and soundtrack level, that kind of thing, the whole film, you know, really good with its technical elements. I don't think I enjoyed it on that level quite as much as I did with 28 Years Later. I thought that film had some slightly more interesting things than this one, but this is still really solid when it comes to its technical aspects. In general, like I said, this is a different film from 28 Years Later. It's more contained and concise to the film's benefit, in my opinion. You know, it's tight, it doesn't let up at any point. It's really just a gripping watch for the entire thing, basically. Overall, I really do think this is a successful continuation of the 28 Years Later story. Now, talking about the negatives, there are a couple of things in here which let me down a little bit. First of all, this really isn't a major issue. It didn't severely impact my enjoyment of the film, but with Jimmy Crystal's gang, I do wish that maybe each member was looked at a little bit more, maybe made a bit more unique and memorable. Not that every member is completely forgettable, that kind of thing, but maybe those characters would have been a bit more engaging if each one was more distinct than they are in this movie, but that's just how I felt about it. Also, with this film, I was quite disappointed by the character of Spike. Obviously, following Spike is what led us to Jimmy Crystal's gang and what led us to where we are with this film. I was hoping this film would, you know, continue Spike's story, his character arc, give us some interesting character development, just do all that stuff a bit more than they do here, and he feels a little bit kind of sidelined for most of it, and that element was disappointing to me personally. Also, with this film, like I said, it works as a middle of the trilogy chapter, But with that said, a lot has been set up over the course of this trilogy, and, you know, this film's just under 2 hours. It's not the longest of films. It did leave me, especially with the ending of this film, just setting up more stuff, it did leave me with the feeling of the last film in this trilogy is going to have to be quite long to look at all the stuff that needs to be looked at, and, you know, just, they really need to stick the landing for all of this to work. I do absolutely have faith in Danny Boyle and Alex Garland and all that stuff, and I'm very much excited for the final film in this trilogy whenever that comes out. But, you know, like I said, this film is more concise than 28 Years Later. It looks at less stuff than 28 Years Later. There's a lot of stuff from 28 Years Later that needs to be looked at, and there's a load of stuff here in this trilogy that needs to be concluded properly, and like, it's always difficult sticking the landing with any trilogy, and that is a challenge that this trilogy does also have to face. But again, I do very much have faith in Danny Boyle and all of that stuff. But yeah, overall, although I don't quite agree with the acclaim this movie is getting and people just saying it's significantly better than 28 Years Later, that kind of thing, I do absolutely think this is a really successful continuation of this story, all things considered. And, you know, it looks at some really interesting ideas and themes in a really quite compelling and just overall entertaining way. So I'm going to give 28 Years Later, The Bone Temple, a 7 out of 10. Thank you very much for watching this review. If you did enjoy, please do remember to like, comment, share, and subscribe if you want to. If you have seen this film, feel free to let me know your thoughts on it in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time, bye bye.